for your responses. I've gotten probably about 25 or 30 responses back already about these videos. I'm hoping that it seems like most of you are finding the videos that break down the text a little bit helpful. So I thought I would do another one here for the 12 tables, which is your next reading after Lucretius and Horatius. Um, and so what I've done here is put side by side the 12 tables and our most famous law code we read this year, which is the Law Codes of Hammurabi. And I do this for a couple of reasons, but the first of which is to look at the kind of format here. If you look at the 12 tables, it begins with the process, right? The how do we call witnesses? What are judges' roles in here? What's the problems with false claims? Things like that, which is identical to how Hammurabi's code began. And so I'd like you to think about that. Why would law codes begin with process? I think that's an interesting point. For here, it starts with things that precede the process, the trial itself, and how the judgment is outlaid. In other words, how long do people have to pay the fines and all of that afterwards. After that, the 12 tables move into family life. And it begins with the idea of paternal power. And this is something that, yes, is included in Hammurabi as well, especially as it pertains to inheritance laws, which is number 5 in the 12 tables. But you see some specific laws here that are at least interesting to consider in terms of what it means about Roman society. The idea that to a father shall be given over a son the power of life and death. That is a great deal of power. And it's important to note that, remember that that's the kind of power that monarchs in the ancient world kind of viewed themselves as having, right? Monarchs were the fathers of their country, and therefore they had complete power to do whatever they wanted, including dealing with things like life and death of their subjects. Here it's given to the father. Think about what that would mean. This next one is one that always sticks out to the students as we read it. If a father thrice, which is a great word, surrenders a son for sale, the son shall be free from the father. You might ask yourself, how the heck, first of all, can a father sell their son? Second of all, once you've sold your son, how can you sell him again, let alone thrice? The answer is this. If someone was in debt, had been lent money, could not repay money, you will remember that this is a major problem in virtually every civilization we studied. Solon came through and got rid of the debtors' prisons or slave or debt slavery in Athens. Here in Rome, it's still a problem. And one of the ways you could pay off your debt would be to, quote unquote, sell your son for a specific amount of time. And I don't remember the limits on that time, if it's 1 year or 3 years, and that would pay off your debt. That would be considered paying off your debt. That's fine, but it appears here that there are at least some limits to the role and the power of the father, because if he sells his son for the third time, the son is allowed to go free at that point. So there is some limitation placed upon this. I'm guessing that's just so a father doesn't just continue to do it over and over and over again just to raise money. But think about what that would be. The role and the image of women comes through very clearly in this law here. And it's a frustrating one, I'm sure, to read. But it definitely gets at the idea of the patriarchy again. Women, even though they are full age, so even if you are a grown woman, it says, because of their levity of mind, shall be under guardianship. Meaning, women are always under a man. whether it's a father, a husband, even eventually a son. Um, the idea that women do not have the mental wherewithal to control themselves was a popular one, and doesn't go away during much of the Roman period. Unfortunately, you see here, just like in Hammurabi's code, there are a ton of laws about stealing and property ownership, right? The idea of private property is very important. Um, you remember in Hammurabi's code, you needed to have a receipt or there were going to be real problems. Here, there's, as long as you've said things specified with his tongue, it is the law. So there is the idea of a verbal contract being legally binding, something that we have adopted in the modern world. Other things that you might sound familiar. If anyone has broken another's limb, there shall be retaliation of its kind, in kind, which means an eye for an eye. Unless the person decides he'd rather have compensation instead of breaking your limb, things like that. Other things that are very similar to Hammurabi's. If a quadruped, I'm hoping you know what a quadruped is. It's a four-legged animal. If one of your ox or whatever else causes damage to another, right? You are responsible for that. I have it in here somewhere. I wish I had saved it. It is in here as well. I'm looking at Hammurabi's code. There it is. If an ox be a goring ox and it's shown that he is a gorer or whatever else, right? This is, the owner is responsible. Here's more about the ox and all of that. So you are responsible for the actions of your property. Again, thievery. You'll remember that if you break a hole into someone's home, you will be buried right by that self-same hole. Same thing here. If someone tries to break in at night, you can legally kill them. By the way, that is a law that might sound familiar in the modern world as well. Think about why that might be. You may not accept stolen property. If someone sells you stolen property, that is not your property. That is still a current law. I want to come back to this one. Actually, you know what? Let's look at all the rest of these a little bit more carefully. I think these last few are the ones I find pretty interesting. This one, number 26 in Table 8, talks about nocturnal meetings, nighttime meetings. Having meetings in secret is something that the people were very worried about. We will see later on, especially when we get into the origins of Christianity, this law being brought back out. The idea that secret meetings tend to be meetings that are going against what is acceptable and against the state is something that the Romans were very worried about. So this is an important law to keep in mind as we move forward. Look at this. You must have a trial, right? You cannot be condemned to death without a trial. That's, again, feels pretty modern. This one just was interesting to me, that you're not allowed to have big, elaborate funerals. The funerals were supposed to be small and simple. It reminds me a little bit of a later Roman philosophy of Stoicism that we'll talk a little bit about. These last two laws are very interesting that I've highlighted. This first one is this idea of intermarriage between plebeians and patricians. Notice, here in the supplementary laws, it is outlawed. I want to talk a little bit about how these laws were actually made. In about 451, I think I have that year right, the plebeians, remember, the plebeians and patricians were kind of struggling. This is in the middle of that struggle for us. The plebeians are the ones who said, you know what, we feel like we are not being treated well. They were looking for legal equality and to just understand what the laws all were. So the plebeians put pressure on the Senate to create this group. They called themselves, or they were called, the Decemvirate. December, it actually means 10. and Virat is It's from Virat's men, so it's 10 men, and these 10 men are the ones who wrote the 12 tables, and the plebeians really hope to gain a lot of equality from these 12 tables, and they do. But here's one law where you see it doesn't. The plebeians are still not allowed to marry patricians at this point. And this causes a lot of tension, so much so that 5 years after the 12 tables were written, that law is overturned, and plebeians are allowed to marry patricians, right? So equality under the law doesn't happen immediately with the 12 tables. It gets pretty darn close. But shortly thereafter, the plebeians are allowed to marry the patricians. And then finally, the last law on the list, which I think is probably the most important one for us to understand. Whatever the people ordain last shall be legally valid. Doesn't sound like a particularly meaningful statement. It is huge. This aspect of Roman law is the basis of our own legal system. Let me explain what that means. This is the idea of legal precedent. In other words, if someone goes to court to try to get to try to get a right protected or to try to change a law, whatever that court decides is now legally binding until another court comes along and changes that law again. So, very famous ones, and probably the most famous and controversial one happened, I think, the year I was born. You may have heard of the case Roe v. Wade, right? And Roe v. Wade is the law that says that, in part, that it is legal to have an abortion in the United States, right? And when people talk about why they are allowed to do that, they point directly to that case because the ruling in that case is what makes that legal. So this idea of laws based on precedent is what has come down to us to be part of our own legal code. I hope that makes sense. I hope you understand how that fits into all of this. And again, I hope this was a relatively helpful chat about the 12 tables. This is a much longer document, well, not much, it's a few more pages, than Lucretia and Horatius, so I wasn't able to go into quite as much detail, but again, I hope this was helpful. Thanks.